So I'm happy to start now the first panel, Building Digital Sovereignty in a Multipolar World, moderated by a frequent guest of MCSC and a driver of digital society, John Higgins. He is president of BCS, the UK's Chartered Institute of IT, and chair of the Global Digital Foundation. He also is an advisor to the European Commission's Intelligent Cities. He was heading Digital Europe until April 2017. And last but not least, the Queen appointed him a commander of the British Empire back in 2005 for his services to the UK IT industry. John Higgins, very happy to have you here. Please introduce your guests.
One of the beauties of a conference that runs over a number of years, and I believe this is the 7th edition now, is that you can see the journey of a topic as it gets discussed from year to year. And we've had some great discussions about digital sovereignty in this conference over the last few years. And I know this year's is going to be, well, as good, if not better, than any. I'm going to take the first few minutes of the panel discussion to set the scene. And then I'm going to go through 2 rounds of questions with our panelists, who I'll introduce as I ask them the first question. Of course, our discussions will be largely through a European lens, but as we heard from Ambassador Ischinger earlier, we're not in an isolated world. In fact, as the agenda said, a multipolar world. So the context of our relations with particularly China and US, but other parts of the world too, I'm sure will come out in the discussions. I really want to try and frame the discussion in 2 substantive parts to start with. First of all, a broader discussion to help us understand digital sovereignty and what it means, before then diving into the implications for cybersecurity. So, what does it mean first? And then what does it mean for cybersecurity second? I do want to have some time, if I manage this correctly, to have some questions from you, the audience. And our colleagues at the conference will be monitoring the chat. So please put questions in the chat. And our colleagues will be monitoring and will be synthesizing. And hopefully we'll get the opportunity to put some of those points to our very distinguished panel today. So the story so far, I mean, this is the bit at the beginning of the latest episode of HIMAT or Fargo or Engrenage or whatever it is you listen to, on previous episodes. But actually this year, there's quite a lot to say by way of scene setting. I will try to be brief, but I just want to refer to actually 7 points, would you believe? First of all, the EU Strategic Agenda 2019-24 says, and I quote, the EU needs to pursue a course of action and increase its capacity to act autonomously to safeguard its interests, uphold its values and way of life, and help shape the global future. Then in the State of the Union address in September 2020, President van der Leyen announced that Europe should secure digital sovereignty with a common vision of the EU in 2030 based on clear goals and principles. Then we have a couple of important letters that also I think set the scene a little bit. On the March the 1st, not very long ago, Chancellor Merkel with the Prime Ministers of Denmark, Estonia and Finland wrote to the President saying, now is the time for Europe to be digitally sovereign. And she set out, or they set out 3 steps. First of all, a SWOT analysis, if you can call it that, this is my paraphrasing, SWOT analysis of the critical technologies and strategic sectors. As an aside, you might have read an article in yesterday's FT from Pat Gelsinger, the CEO of Intel, noting that 80% of the world's semiconductors are now made in Asia, and that's moved in 30 years, when at that point, 30 years ago, Europe had a 44% market share, now only 10%. So the second point in the letter, the Union must strengthen and refine its policy approach for these critical technologies and sectors. And the third point was put a monitoring system in place. That followed, 4th point, with a letter from 8 member states leaders, slightly less detailed letter. But the letter said, we share many of the ideas outlined in the Chancellor Merkel letter. We share many of the ideas. And there are some points we find of particular importance. We agree that our agenda must be founded on a good mix of self-determination and openness. The first mention in that letter of digital leadership. Then probably be the 5th, the following day, actually on the 9th of March, the European Commission produced its Europe's Digital Decade and set out digital targets for 2030 and introduced this idea of a digital compass, with the 4 points of the compass being practical plans for skills, infrastructure, digital transformation of business, and digital transformation of government. Then on the 24th of March, perhaps by way of like keeping the Commission's feet to the fire, there was a Spain-Netherlands non-paper. Anybody who's not from Europe will have to have that explained to them. We have lots of non-papers in Europe, which are actually papers. And it said, although the concept of strategic autonomy was linked traditionally to European security and defence, the pandemic marks a turning point. I think that's the point made there. And last but by no means least, as if to keep the attention focused even more, on the 21st of April, so literally only a few days ago, the trio presidency produced a note called Paths Towards European Digital Sovereignty from the Perspective of Industrial and Internal Market Policy. So that's me being able to refer to 7 points of introducing European digital sovereignty, all happening in the last few months. Let me turn to our panelists. Sir Julian King, you were the European Commissioner for the Security Union until 2019. Now you're advising clients and working with RUSI, a very well-known think tank. We'd love to hear, first of all, your perspectives on digital sovereignty, and if you have a moment to address the major challenges ahead to achieve that digital sovereignty, that would be excellent. Sir Julian.
Well, thank you, and it's good to have the opportunity to be back with the conference, albeit virtually this year. So, a quick recap. Strategic autonomy, as you've just mentioned, goes through those various different documents. It goes back to the defense world. So it's entirely appropriate that we should be talking about it in the context of the Munich Security Conference, where it was about the ability and having the capabilities to act on your own if you need to, but with allies where you can. But it's developed and grown, as your introduction has explained, beyond defense to scarce resources, supply and sustain, the tech world, so we get tech and digital sovereignty, and indeed more generally to various aspects of economic policy, which is where we got to today, recognizing that tech is a very important part of the economy. In the end, I think it comes down to the EU and member states thinking about how they can most effectively leverage the single market, which is their strategic asset. A market of 450 million with many millions of businesses, if you include small and medium-sized businesses as well. It is a very important part of the global economy. And so the EU thinks about how to leverage that in two ways, essentially, defensively and offensively. Defensively by conditioning access to that market. That's not new. It's been done in many areas before. But in relation to tech, that means thinking about conditions around data, regulation, privacy, some of the conditions for actually engaging with that market. Offensively, if you like, it's about setting standards and norms for that market and beyond internationally. And I think both of those activities, as I say, are entirely legitimate. You just have to be careful how you do them. And this is something we may come on to in a bit more detail. When you're thinking about conditioning access, you just have to be a little bit careful that you don't tip into measures that might be protectionist. And when you're thinking about how you might set norms and international behavior, I think you just have to be a little bit careful about not just going it alone. Because, as I hope we'll discuss, this is really a game where you want to work with partners. particularly with like-minded partners, many of whom will be your EU neighbours and partners, but some of whom are outside of the EU. So how do you reach out and work with them? That, broadly speaking, I think is the sort of the framework of strategic autonomy as applied to the tech sector, tech sovereignty, and the challenge.
Thank you very much, Julian. Yeah, I like the categorization into defensive and offensive, and I think your point about being careful not to slip into protectionism, also topics we might explore. May I turn to Dr. Grienberger, Regine, if I may call you that, the Director for Cyber, Foreign and Security Policy at the Federal Foreign Office, but with extensive EU policy experience and background. And I wondered if you can perhaps develop a little more the foreign policy implications of Europe's digital sovereignty aspirations, with your own view of what you think the digital sovereignty means, of course.
Yeah, thank you, John. Well, you're talking to a diplomat, and therefore you will not be surprised that I would describe digital sovereignty even in a broader sense than what we discussed until now. So, in my understanding, digital sovereignty means not only that technological choices are possible, so that the Europeans own or have access to certain critical technologies, and that they are able to develop these and innovate these technologies in an economically viable way. But there are two more aspects that I think are important. The first one is digital sovereignty means also that we are able to protect our citizens in a digital environment. This is dealing with cybersecurity, of course, IT security, and of course also preventing a cyber war. But it is also making sure that human rights and fundamental freedoms are also observed in the digital space, in cyberspace, and online as well as offline. And of course, there is this question of privacy and data sovereignty, and this is also part of protecting our citizens. I think this is important to understand. And then also important is an important element of this concept is that we make sure that our EU rules are respected. So first of all, this is about rule setting, of course, but then also about rule implementation and rule enforcement. And what you were asking me is, what do we do with our partners? Of course, we have to explain this concept to our partners, get support from them, explain it also to our adversaries, and making sure that they understand where we are heading to. We had a very good experience with the GDPR, so the Data Privacy Directive. And this is something, I would say, this is the gold standard of how we could do this, make our EU rules respected. And we have a lot of items on the digital agenda now, and it is really important that we are talking about this with our American partners before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Regine. I think some good references to GDPR there, and an example of what Julian was talking about, norm setting for sure. And I wonder whether the EU is about to do the same thing with the AI regulation as well. Our next panelist is Hester Somsen. And Hester, you also a diplomat, Dutch diplomat and former ambassador, but recently appointed as the Deputy National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, and as the Director for cybersecurity and state threats. So also with a background in international relations. I wonder if I can be blunt, does this concept of European digital sovereignty make sense to you? Or does, with your experience, should we be putting our efforts behind a broader grouping of like-minded states?
Thank you very much, John. And indeed, I do think that it makes a lot of sense. And also by you just setting the scene with the 7 important documents that came out just recently, I think we've come to the stage that we really appreciate its concept, and that's actually necessary to become more digital autonomous than we are today. And I think also the example that was just given by Julian when it comes to the semiconductor, also that's something that is on top of our minds. And then to see how can you work on dependence.
Have we lost Hester? I can't hear you, Hester. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, I think we might have lost Hester. Okay, well, look, I'm going to come back to Hester if the connection, this is always the challenge with these online events, isn't it? So if I move to our fourth panelist, Tom Enders. Tom, is this Hester back online? Hester, are you back with us? We lost you there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure what happened, but at the moment wanted to talk a bit about our geopolitical adversary. So I'm never sure whether
that's right. Yeah.
Itself. But no, I think it's good also to take maybe a step back on that perspective. And indeed was mentioned already a bit like partner, of course, with other countries. And I think it's good to have this division in mind in the sense that we are dealing more with three poles in this sense, I think, in the sense that you have, of course, the liberal democracy, the free markets, and of course, US, UK are extremely important parts in that, but also the authoritarian state capitalism that we see is also gaining some more influence in the world that we are in today on China and Russia. But I think also it's very important not to forget the third pole, and that is the private technology companies and financial institutions whose power seem to be sometimes difficult to tame by democratic governments. And I think that's also part of this digital sovereignty on how to together with these companies and provide make sure that our European values taken aboard, and then indeed some of the more offensive standard setting might be a very good solution to that. But I'm sure that we'll touch upon that later also.
Thank you, Hester. So, Tom, you're in a fantastic position, if I might say so. You're now the president of the German Council for Foreign Relations, so in the heart of the land of diplomacy. But for many years, 14 years, I think, you were the CEO of Airbus and the ADS. And one of the things that I often think is when we have these discussions about digital sovereignty, what does that mean for business decisions? What choices should business leaders make when they see, and how does that affect the business decision? So, I mean, from this fantastic position, Tom, from a business position and from being the president, so really interested to hear your perspective.
Well, thanks, John. I hope you don't mind. I'm not a diplomat, but yes, from a business position, let me say, while all these activities we had right now in Europe, I mean, even experts, I think, can't keep track on all the initiatives at EU level, then at the national levels, all the money, the billions that are thrown to the digital sphere. I think the recovery facility, the COVID fund wants to dedicate 20% of a fund, which is more than 600 billion, to the so-called digital transition. I sometimes have a feel that decision makers forget a little bit about the business sphere. Let me say a little bit provocatively, it's very nice to have a digital compass 2030, but the ordinary company doesn't care that much about 2030 right now. It's about how do I improve, how do I digitalize, how do I build a data platform for my company or for the industry which I'm working in the next couple of years, in order to leverage. Everybody's understood that. In business, we've understood that already 7-8 years ago, at least, that data, as Wolfgang Ischinger said, is power. that data is the gold, the oil of yesterday, and that we need to leverage our data for the good of the business, our products, but also for the digital services around that. So I'm wondering sometimes with all the initiatives whether this aspect is taken adequately into account. And then, of course, at the very core of it, what is absolutely necessary, and I think many initiatives fortunately take that into account, is we need to invest into our people. We need to invest into digital education. We need to invest into skills. We must not forget that if we want to build digital sovereignty, and I don't want to discuss the term here, we need an environment, create an environment of blooming innovation in Europe. Innovation is at the very core of it. And when I look at my experience with Brussels and previous initiatives, I don't want to mention the Lisbon goals or Europe 2020. I think we can say fairly mixed success or mixed results. Horizon 2020, we had a lot of red tape, much too much red tape around these initiatives. And very practically, I remember sending letters with other business leaders to Brussels, say, for heaven's sake, help us with all this red tape. Otherwise, we can never leverage the money, the budgets, our own funding that would go into these initiatives. So that I would really underline is important for business. And when it comes to cyber and cyber threats, I think we also need to see that commercial companies can contribute a lot here. Cybersecurity today, if you leave that to the legacy services, I think we're all lost. We need new capabilities. We need advanced capabilities, and these capabilities are usually not with the legacy security services, and the talents are not with the legacy security services. They are with the commercial businesses. And here I think that the talents, the advanced capabilities of these commercial companies in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, no problem if we can leverage US capabilities here, if these certain our goals. This is not adequately taken care of right now. I stop here, John.
Thanks, Tom. You make some very good points, and you move us nicely into the cybersecurity aspects. I mean, Hester, you're relatively recently appointed into this cyber role after many years, as a very senior diplomat in your country. I mean, when you think about digital sovereignty and cyber, what does it mean to you? What are the implications for the role that you have?
Well, maybe also a recent example, when we had the Microsoft Exchange hack. I think that has affected many of us, and earlier on also SolarWinds was already mentioned by colleagues in the panel. And the question then, of course, is what can we do? What can we do to protect our citizens? What can we do to protect the companies? And part of that should be by, I think, a certification scheme in the EU, and the Cybersecurity Act mentions that as well, trying to lift also the security of these software products. But then, of course, you have to have a proper discussion also with these companies, and also about what is the liability from companies, software producing companies, to other companies that use them. If you want to bring in a car in the European Union, you have to adhere to the highest security standard. And that, of course, is something a bit different in this field. And I would say that as a European Union, you really have to be able to set those standards as well. You cannot ask from a small or medium-sized company to have their cybersecurity top-notch, like we expect for banks, for instance. But then how can such a company provide for its own security? That is partly standard setting. That is, of course, also by, I think, being more aware of these risks of supply chain that are there. And also how can we make sure when there is an interaction between maybe state actors and criminal actors, how can you deal with that? It was earlier on mentioned also, I think, by the commissioner that we have now this EU sanction package also on possible the use of cyber by some of the actors. It's not. It's really focused on entities, but this is something I think where we should have a whole of government approach within the EU to make sure that you have this security at hand.
I'll unmute myself. If I can move to you, Regine, and pick up on that. I mean, some of what Hester describes there doesn't need, I might argue, doesn't need digital sovereignty for Europe. What it needs is Europe to cooperate as one bloc, you know, in the way that it does through ENISA and other, you know, member state structures. I mean, what more does it need than what it already has to sort of operate as one block, essentially, when it comes to sharing best practice and, you know, up-to-date intelligence and so on? Why does it need digital sovereignty?
Well, of course, we have very good preconditions in Europe because, for example, in cybersecurity, we master the whole stack from research to IT security firms. Of course, these are good preconditions, but it means also that we have to preserve this for the future, which means that we have to have the ability to innovate, and innovation is just secured if you have also the possibility to market the product that you are innovating. So I think this is an important aspect. Most of what we see in cybersecurity incidents are, of course, cybercrime, but we have also a considerable and increasing number of state actors or state-sponsored actors who are targeting European critical infrastructure, public institutions, companies, of course, and also individuals. So this is something where we need to develop specific capabilities. And I'm talking, of course, about civil protection, but I'm also talking about military capabilities. And this is something where we are just at the start at the moment.
Thank you, Regine. Peter, I will come to you in a moment and ask you if there are synthesis of questions from the audience. But so, Julian, I wondered if I could come to you. When you were the commissioner for 3 years and you were responsible for the security union, was digital sovereignty like top of your list, or were there other instruments and other approaches that you could use to make Europe a player in cybersecurity? You know, basically make Europe secure.
Well, when I came into the role, you'll remember 2015, 2016, there'd been a wave of horrible terrorist attacks across Europe. So that was, at that time, the top priority. But the cybersecurity went up the agenda very, very fast on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, because of some of the big attacks. We've mentioned them already, attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya. Because of the boom, unfortunately, in cybercrime, which has continued. We've already heard some of the statistics about that. I mean, it's costing over 1% of global GDP by some estimates now. Because of illegal activities and illegal content online, going from child sexual exploitation content through to terrorist content. Because of allegations, and in some cases beyond allegations, of political interference in electoral processes, and because of a growing awareness, again, both sides of the Atlantic, about the need to better protect our critical digital infrastructure, one example of which was the big debate around 5G. So there are a whole series of factors that force this agenda forward. While I'm on, can I just make one comment going back to what Wolfgang Ischinger said in his introduction? He underlined the importance of thinking about transatlantic cooperation on these issues, and I think he's absolutely right. It should be, it should be pretty clear that at least when the context is the shared strategic challenge of China, not just China, but China, we ought to be thinking about some of these issues together. But sometimes it's difficult. The proposed EU-US Tech Council hasn't kicked off yet. I hope it does soon. When it does kick off, it's going to have to deal with some of the differences of approach. There are differences of approach within Europe, but also between Europe and the US over digital tax, regulation and the balance between regulation and innovation, and attitudes to privacy. Not that anybody ignores privacy, but where do you put it and how do you balance it? So those are sometimes challenging subjects to discuss together. But one thing that definitely should unite us, and this is where I come back to your question, is the cybersecurity challenge. There is no reason at all that I can see why we should not be able to work effectively together. And I wouldn't be a Brit if I didn't mention also with other like-minded countries like the UK on the cyber security challenges. So actually, I see cybersecurity in an odd way as a bit of an opportunity here.
Thank you very much, Julian. So, Peter, if you can hear me, is there a sort of summary of great questions from this brilliant audience that you've lined up? I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Yes, ja, ich habe schon. Jetzt muss mein Panel. I hear you, John. Thank you. We are looking for questions. So if meanwhile you
carry on.
Continue, we'll question. There's a question by Tyson Barker. I don't know. You see that in the chat?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Tyson. Maybe we'll come to that in a moment. I'd quite like, if I could, to stay on this international theme for a moment. I mean, and turn to Tom. Tom, we fall into this. I mean, I think we fall into this analysis at the moment that the Biden administration looks hopeful and transatlantic relations will get going, and and everything will look a lot better. And in the meantime, we see China as an increasingly large threat. But is that how business sees the world?
Well, I think that we could even question our headline. Whether we are building a digital sovereignty in a multipolar world, or are we not increasingly going back into a bipolar world? I mean, the US and China are the big elephants, and Europe has to look for its place in the middle. I think we cannot and should not assume that we have a sunshine scenario with the Americans now for the next 50 years or something. I mean, maybe Biden, I hope is just an interplay before the waters get the transatlantic waters get again troubled. We don't know that. But picking up on what Julian and Regine said, I think we cannot possibly begin talking about digital sovereignty as long as we have a situation in Europe, in the EU and its member states, where we are not even able to deter state-sponsored cyber attacks or criminal, particularly ransomware attacks today. We have no doctrine of retaliation, and this is very different from the US with its persistent engagement doctrine, i.e., that allows also for preemptive cyber attack. And I think, if I may say so, John, also with the National Cyber Force that the UK has stood up some 5 months ago. I think as a priority from a practical point of view, before we get something big going in the EU, I would much rather see France and Germany working together, plus the UK. Why should that not be possible? UK is out of the EU, but the UK is still in NATO. If these three nations would really integrate and coordinate their cyber capabilities, and that is the whole range, and develop a persistent engagement doctrine, I think we would be far better off. And the other point I wanted to make is we jumped perhaps a little bit too quickly to the hardcore cybersecurity. At DGAP, we have just done a comprehensive report, which we call Europe's capacity to act in the global tech race, because we didn't want to talk about digital sovereignty. And we've been looking at 5 key technology areas. That is artificial intelligence, cloud computing, semiconductors, 5G, 6G mobile networks, and quantum computing. We could certainly add other areas, but all these areas are areas where Europe needs to catch up. Probably the least, or Europe is best positioned in the mobile networks through Nokia and Ericsson, and has a chance also in quantum technologies. But all these areas also feed into cybersecurity. In other words, if you don't have a significant innovative potential in the European Union, that hampers, that necessarily limits your ability to produce cybersecurity in the years ahead, 2030 or whatever.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hester, let me come back to you. From what you've just been hearing from Julian and Tom there, I mean, what comments would you make on the sort of observations that they've just told us about?
Thank you very much, John. And indeed, I do think that in certain areas we have to catch up, and in other areas we have to make sure that we stay ahead of the game. And one of the things that is then extremely important is the emerging European data spaces. You need to be able to work with data in all these different fields that Tom just mentioned also. And there we have hardly any players ourselves. So this is really something where I think we should join hands and see how we can work on that. And that's partly trying to set up own cloud systems, but it's maybe also, again, going back to regulations, like how can the data be shared and under what conditions? And I think it's these kind of things, moving on to the next steps where we really can get into the practicality of things and what's actually needed, and how then to work together with partners, but also make sure that we will be able to make our own decisions once that's absolutely necessary. Of course, preferably with partners, but to a certain extent also when necessary by ourselves. And there it's really where we think we have to make additional steps and encourage also, I think, this cooperation with the private sector, the knowledge base that we have. So our universities are extremely well prepared for this also. But we should continue to support them and come together in this triple helix and make sure that we use the advantages that are at hand also.
Well, I think Sabine introduced the fact that one of the things I'm involved with is the European Commission's Intelligent Cities Challenge, and I love it because I'm working with European cities across Europe. And that triple helix, in fact, we refer to it as the quadruple helix as well, with civil society. I mean, it's so critical to the success of cities as they attempt to digitalize and modernize. So I'm absolutely with you on that. Listen, we've got a couple of minutes left, and it would be appropriate if I asked you each for your one or two things, maybe one thing that you think is critical to Europe achieving some sort of digital sovereignty in the way that we've described it. So maybe I can turn to Julian first and then Regine next. So what's the one thing, Julian?
So there's one thing that's critical, which has already come up in the discussions and in some of the speeches, and that is a really serious effort on investment. But there's one comment, not perhaps critical, but which I'd like to make, which is picking up something Tom just said, which is, yes, let's find a way on these issues, the broad family of cyber issues, of also cooperating with the UK. The UK has left the European Union, but it is still a neighbour, and on these issues, a strong partner. Some of this cooperation will migrate to NATO or elsewhere, but actually a good deal of it, a lot of it, is rightly done through the European Union, because the European Union has the right mix of policies and capabilities and partners to advance this agenda in the way that we've all been discussing. And actually, over the last few years, there's been good UK input on these issues, both on the cybercrime side, some of the hardcore cybersecurity issues, and on resilience. And so I hope we'd be able to find a way of keeping that cooperation going.
Let's hope so, Julian. And Regine, last quick comment from you.
Yeah, let me say I would like to see digital sovereignty not so much as a state to be reached, but more a working method that we follow.
Very good thought. Very good thought. And Tom? You're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. I think I mentioned that already. I think it's high time that the EU, or at least member states, the coalition of the willing,
yeah,
start seriously developing
seriously
persistent engagement doctrine on cyber. Secondly, innovation, and ask what industry really needs. And the EU should not be tempted to put too much emphasis on regulation, because if you do that, you might strangle innovation that you need tomorrow in the EU.
Indeed.
At least the correlation, I think, between innovation and regulation is not yet what it should be. I mean, I think it's not always closely correlated. And I think these are the points I'd like to make.
So we leave the last thought to you, Hester.
Thank you very much. Well, big burden on my shoulder, but I think indeed you mentioned earlier this SWOT analysis that we have to do. And I think really it also comes down to the granularity of things. I think, first of all, we would like to preserve our open data. That's how we got our wealth. That's why many of the European countries produce the happiest kids in the world. So we have to preserve that. Then you have to have a certain amount of granularity to see where you have to be more independent and make sure that if there is a dependency, that one is balanced and that you can leverage it.
Thank you very much, Hester. Can I end by thanking my colleagues in BCW Brussels office for their help with the preparation, and colleagues at the Chartered Institute in the UK for their help too. But can I also really thank our panelists for making such a great contribution, and I hope, Peter, you would agree with me that was a great panel to kick off.
It was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for everyone joining. It's been a great opening, a wonderful and necessary discussion. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for making yourself available to be here virtually. Hope to see you in February next year again here in person at the Hotel Bayerischer Hof. Thank you so much for joining, and have a good reminder of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.